We're going to be all over the place this morning. So if you've got a Bible close to you, or you can get your Bible up on your phone, do that. Let me give you a little introduction. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to be centered around Acts 16. But there's so much more to the story than is described there, the first few verses of Acts 16, that I want us, 1 Corinthians 16, that I want us to spend a little time today just in information, just some background, some historical discussion. Try to be chronological if I can. And then next week we'll talk a little bit more about the subject of giving in the New Testament church. Now there are congregations and denominations across the world who do all kinds of weird and wonderful things in the way that they do donations and contributions. But what I want to do is just unfold for you what was going on in the first century church. I am, at least to a large degree, a restorationist. I believe that the best way to know how to do church and how to be Christians is to go back and look at how the originals got it done. Those that were either in the presence of Jesus to begin with or who learned about him shortly after his death. So the first century church is where we should go look at these things. I'll give you an example of the most wild and wonderful practice that I've been around. When I was in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, many, many years ago, one of the large churches in town had boxes at the entryway to the seating area into the church, and little envelopes where you would fill out who you were and put your contribution in and drop it in the box. I found out later that they would check those, and if you had not given a full 10% of what they knew to be your yearly income, that they would send you a bill in the mail. So I'm making sure that Kay gets our mailing list updated so I can find you, and we'll start that next week. Now that's amazing to me that that's the way people did that, but they actually did. Not at all. That's as far from the New Testament pattern as it could possibly be. So like I said, we're going to try to go chronologically this morning and look at the beginnings of giving, both individual and corporate, in the New Testament church. And hopefully that'll set us up for next week where we can talk about ourselves a little bit. How does this affect us? How can this encourage me to enjoy the giving that I had the opportunity to do? We're going to start in Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 42. Just after the day of Pentecost, 3,000 people baptized that day, followed shortly thereafter by another couple thousand coming into the body. So we're told that there were about 5,000 male believers. It doesn't give us a total tally, but some think maybe as many as 20,000 in the first few months of the church in Jerusalem. And here's how Luke describes their relationship to us. Acts 2:42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes, and they ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number daily those who were being saved. So we start out with just a voluntary sharing. Individuals who saw that other individuals had needs, and so they were sharing amongst themselves. And Luke tells us that they went so far as some of them began to sell possessions. I don't need this as much as I need you to have something to eat. So they would sell the possession, and they would bring the money for the individuals who were in need. So that's a wonderful pattern. I mean, those of us who are in Christ today, perhaps we do that sometimes. We just see somebody in need, and we take care of it. Go over to Acts chapter 4, a little bit later on in the life of the church. There became an even more pronounced need, perhaps. And so there were believers who were selling larger possessions, and they were bringing the money to the apostles. Acts 4, beginning in verse 32. All the believers were one in heart and in mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them. They brought the money from the sales, and they put it at the apostles' feet, and so it was distributed to anyone who had a need. And this is where we meet Barnabas for the first time. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means the son of encouragement, sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet. So we have individual to individual. And then a little bit later on, the congregation has grown so much that they begin to bring the money and give it to the apostles so that the apostles can distribute it as it's needed. So maybe in the beginning, I know you, we're connected, I provide for you what you need. But a little later on, the congregation is larger, there's more needs. So Barnabas sells a piece of property, brings the money, gives it to the apostles, and the apostles then are given the opportunity to share that money with whoever it is that is in need. Let me point out a couple of things to you. There's no mention of a general collection. In a little bit, we're going to read 1 Corinthians 16. We're all very familiar with it. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay by in store. There's no first day of the week lay by in store in Jerusalem. It's just not happening. They're selling property. They're bringing it and laying the money at the apostles' feet so that it can be distributed. Later on, this work becomes controversial because when you have that many people and there's money being brought in and distributed, there's always going to be somebody who's getting a better care than others, right? There's just so many people. In this case, it ended up being a group of widows who were from the Hellenistic group of Jews. In other words, they lived more like the Greeks than like the Jews. And their women were being overlooked. They were in need, and so the money was being passed out. But the Jewish widows, who were living more like Jews, were getting their money first. They were being cared for first. And these Hellenistic Jewish women were not being cared for. So a complaint is lodged with the apostles. We need for somebody to pay attention to us. We need somebody to take care of us. So look at Acts chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. In those days, when the number of the disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the Word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. And we will turn this responsibility over to them, and we'll give our attention to prayer and to the ministry of the Word." Again, there's still no mention of Sunday morning pass the plate. There's no lay by in store on the first day. This is people who are selling property. They're bringing the proceeds from the property and giving it to the apostles. Well, now the apostles say, our job is to preach the gospel. We weren't left here to stand between disputes between Hebraic Jewish women and Hellenistic Jewish women. That's not what the Lord sent us to do. So we're going to keep doing our job, which is preaching and instructing, working miracles, doing all those things. And we're going to give this job to somebody else. And so we have this first group of guys that we would call deacons, who are given the responsibility of distributing all of these funds as they become available. The distribution was daily. This was happening constantly. There was always somebody in need. And because of the grace of God and their faith, there was always somebody who was willing to take care of them. So the church was taking care of its own needs from within. But what about contributions that were sent outside the local congregation? Paul and Barnabas are up in Antioch, working with a congregation of believers up there. There's both Jews and Gentiles in that congregation. And they're the first group of folks that take up collections to send somewhere else. And when you look at Jerusalem, Jerusalem is taking up contributions to help the congregation in Jerusalem. When you get to Antioch, Antioch is taking up contributions to send down to Jerusalem to help with that group, because Jerusalem was prone to having droughts in those days. And so there's not a lot of food, there's not a lot of opportunity for them to share amongst themselves. They're running low on supplies. And so the church at Antioch decides to intervene. Look at chapter 11, verse 25. So Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. When he found him, he brought him to Antioch, and for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church, and they taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. During this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, whose name was Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. Now this happened during the reign of Claudius. The disciples, as each one was able, decided to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea, and they did this, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. So they do the exact same thing that the church in Jerusalem was doing. They made sure that they got their gifts together and they sent them to Jerusalem. But now we have one congregation sending funding to another congregation. There are congregations within the churches of Christ that don't like that pattern. They don't like to do that. But I think most of us understand that sometimes that's a good way to get it done. There's a congregation over here that has a need. We send the money to them. They know how to take care of that money and how to use it. So perhaps you have somebody in Antioch have a possession. They sell the possession. They give the money to Saul and Barnabas. Saul and Barnabas take it to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, it's brought to the apostles. The apostles give it to the deacons. The deacons make sure that it gets passed out. Right? So we've got kind of a chain going on now of how this money was distributed. But again, there's a need being met specifically, but not weekly. Right? There's not a weekly contribution. We don't see anywhere in any of this the call for lay by and store on the first day of the week. The 1 Corinthians 16 passage has not shown up in the pattern yet in the way things are being done. All right, look at Galatians chapter 2. Galatians chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 9. This is a trip that Paul and Barnabas made to Jerusalem, probably about the circumcision question, so you might reference for Acts 15 on this one. The apostles give 4 directives for the Gentile churches. Don't eat meat offered to idols. Don't eat meat with the blood in it. Don't eat meat from strangled animals, and stay away from sexual immorality. Those are the 4 things that they asked Paul to share with the churches. But look at verse 9, Galatians 2, verse 9. James and Cephas, that is Peter, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. So Paul and Barnabas go down, they visit with them, they take a gift to them, and the elders say, okay, the Gentile Christians, they don't need to be circumcised, they just need to keep these 4 things, right? Don't eat meat offered to idols, don't eat blood, don't eat meat from strangled animals, and stay away from sexual immorality. And by the way, Paul, would you remember the poor? The poor that they're talking about are the folks in Jerusalem. Right? We've got big famines going on. Don't forget about us. We know that you're going to the Gentiles. We know that you're going to be the minister to them as we're the minister to the Jews. But don't forget us. Don't get busy over there and forget the fact that the congregation in Jerusalem is also in need. So Paul and Silas, when they go on what we call the second missionary journey, they're sharing all of these things with the congregations. Right? Paul and Barnabas went together on the first journey, and they went into Galatia, and they formed some congregations. Paul and Silas go back to some of those same places in the second missionary journey, and they're telling them what they heard. Right? We went to Jerusalem. Here are the 4 things that the elders in Jerusalem think you need to follow. And by the way, they're having all kinds of droughts in Jerusalem, and we're collecting money to help the folks in Jerusalem who are in these drought situations. Okay? So look at Acts 16, beginning in verse 1. Acts 16, beginning verse 1. It almost gets overshadowed because we meet a young man in this passage that all of us come to know. We know this name. This is one of Paul's sons in the Spirit, in the faith. Acts 16:1, Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in their numbers. Now you might notice that while we're excited about Timothy, we give those 4 things that the apostles sent us to tell them, but there's no mention of giving here. Right? So hang on to that thought for a minute. There's no mention of collection. There's no mention of the first day of the week. There's no mention of any of those things that all of us know when we say, well, what about giving in the New Testament church? We immediately run to 1 Corinthians 16. Right? So let's run over there. We've got enough background to see how all this fits together. 1 Corinthians 16, beginning in verse 1. Now about the collection for the Lord's people. Do what I told the Galatian churches to do. Let's stop right there. In Acts 16, we learn about Timothy. We get excited about Timothy. We've got those 4 things, right? The elders in Jerusalem said that we should tell you this. So here's those 4 things. But Paul also must have talked to them about the gift for the church at Jerusalem, because he tells the Corinthian church, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. So Timothy is from Galatia. Paul goes over, he gets Timothy. He tells them what the elders had told them to tell them, those 4 things, and evidently told them to, on the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men whom you approve, and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. And if it seems advisable for me to go also, they will accompany me. Okay? So this is not just a contribution inside a single congregation in Jerusalem. That's where we started. Folks in Jerusalem selling property, giving money for folks in Jerusalem. It's not even just a gift from one church to another, like we had Antioch, getting a contribution, sending it with Saul and Barnabas down to Jerusalem. This is all over the Mediterranean basin. We've got folks in Galatia. We're going to find out that there's also folks in Philippi and Macedonia that are taking up a collection. I'm going to assume, although we don't have a passage for it, that the folks in Thessalonica and Berea took up collections as well. All of these folks around the Mediterranean basin are trying to make sure that the church in Jerusalem is cared for. 1 Corinthians 16 is about a contribution that is being sent to Jerusalem. That's what it's about. It is not about 2024, how do we pay the light bill? Now we're going to make some applications from this next week. But historically, chronologically, what has happened is one congregation took care of itself, then one congregation took care of another congregation, and now multiple congregations are getting together a gift in order that they can send it to Jerusalem. And Paul's job, or at least one of his jobs, is to share with the Gentiles these four things that the apostles in Jerusalem have told you to do, plus remember the poor. Make sure that this contribution is put together for them. So, again, we're talking about the needy saints. In the New Testament, when you're looking at a passage about giving, about 99.9% of the time, you're talking about a gift for the saints of Jerusalem. That's the context that's going on. The other percentage is, what do we do about these guys who are ministering to us? Should we give them something physical in return? So Paul talks about that a little bit as well. So we get Paul's general game plan for collecting the aid for Jerusalem. Each one of you should put something aside. Now you notice that this is not a collection passage. Each one of you should set something aside so that there be no collections when I come. So I want you to take care of all of the preliminary. I want you to get all of the funding together and have it all in one place at one time, so that when I get there, we don't have to stop what we're doing in ministry and say, okay, all of you guys that want to give, go to the bank, go to the real estate agent, sell your properties, do all that stuff. I want all of this taken care of in advance, so that when I get there, we don't have to do all of that stuff at one time. He's going to have ambassadors who are going to Macedonia, who are going to Galatia, who are going to, up that western coast of Achaia where Corinth is, and getting all these collections together. And he says, when I get there, then I will send letters with whomever you want to take this gift. So Paul has it all lined out. He's got it all figured out. His one big problem is that he doesn't stick with plan A. Plan A is, when I get there, and you've got all this collection made, I'll send letters, and then they can just take the gift. And then he says at the end, kind of just an afterthought, or if you think it's better that I go too, then they can come with me and we'll go to Jerusalem. Does anybody remember what happens to Paul when he takes the gift to Jerusalem? He gets beat up in the temple. They have to save him. The Romans have to come in and save him and take him to the fortress Antonia. They've got a death squad out to get him. He has to escape in the middle of the night and go to Caesarea. He's in jail, in prison for over 4 years, close to 5 years. He's shipwrecked. If Paul had just stayed in Corinth and said, now you guys can all send a letter with you, he'd have had a lot less trouble. But he doesn't. He goes to Jerusalem along with the gift, which we won't talk about it much, but when you think about how much time and effort he put in to giving a gift to the church in Jerusalem, and he wasn't received as well as what I think he might have been received. All right. So we find out that Paul has been talking about this with the folks in Galatia. He's been talking about it with the folks in Macedonia. We're going to find out in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 that the folks in Philippi were involved in it. So this is a Mediterranean basin collection that's going on under Paul's authority and auspices. Now, how could we apply that to us? Well, there's a million different ways. We're going to spend some time next week in doing that. So I hope that you'll be here again next week so that you get both parts in person. If you have questions about any of this stuff, holler at me, stop me in the foyer, accost me on the street, whatever it is. I want you to understand that what we do as a restoration church is very similar to what they did, how they did it, but the background information, the reasonings behind what they were doing are somewhat different from the way things are in the way we use the contribution. So we'll talk more, Lord willing, about that next week.